Hey everybody, this is Derwin from the Dead President Society, and we're doing another check-in with our senior medical correspondent, Dr. Matt. How are we doing, Dr. Matt?
I'm doing excellent. How are you doing?
Fantastic. And with us, as always, is Pete, all the way from the far side of the world. Pete, how are we doing?
I am doing fantastic. I'm excited to get some medical expertise about how some of our presidents passed away.
I'm so excited. And so today we're going to talk about President Warren G. Harding and the mysterious circumstances of his death. Now, officially, and Pete, correct me if I'm wrong here, Mr. Harding died from a heart attack with air quotes, right? But there was questions behind it and everyone looks kind of suspicious. But Pete, what do you have to add there?
Well, it is interesting. However, no autopsy was conducted. He was embalmed within hours of his death, and they were getting the funeral arrangements just done lickety-quick. So, but there was plenty of details about his health conditions leading up to his death. To include, he was on a journey of understanding all up and down the West Coast, and that is North America's West Coast.
Yeah.
He went all the way up to Alaska. He was going through Canada. And whenever you're in that region, you gotta try the local food. He tried some seafood he was not used to and was complaining of severe stomach cramps, diarrhea, nausea. So initially people weren't worried about his health because they just thought, oh, this guy just had some bad shellfish. But if it was, that was some real bad shellfish. And Matt, I don't know if you are also aware there is conspiracy theories about Warren G. Harding's death.
I'm not aware.
As is always the case.
Oh, of course.
And it doesn't help matters much. And this doesn't help matters with the conspiracy theory or his actual death, that his own personal physician was a very experimental homeopathic doctor. The fine tradition of throw everything at the wall and see if it sticks.
Yeah, even for kind of the time period in the 1920s, it was still an era of throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. There was still we'd still not developed antibiotics by then. Doing whatever we could was a very interesting endeavor, to say the least. Didn't have the same kind of medical technology, like kind of going through that, like kind of nausea, vomiting. That was like pretty much, sounds like everybody in the 1800s died of nausea and vomiting.
It's a Tuesday.
Yeah, it was Tuesday. Yeah, you're vomiting everything. Everything was basically coming out of both ends nonstop. Coming into like an emergency department today, I'd say there's a good chance that Warren G. Harding wouldn't have died. We would have figured out what was going on with him, and there's a chance that we would have been able to treat his medical condition. That being said, in that time period, we didn't have ultrasound to look inside someone's heart to see if there was something going on there. We didn't have that great of an understanding of chest x-rays, even though they did exist back then, but they were very basic.
When you say basic, what do you mean?
So now it's everything's like hooked up to a computer. So you slide a film, you get shot and exposed to, everything's very controlled. Back then, there weren't as great controls with how much radiation someone was exposed to.
Oh, no.
Pretty dangerous. I mean, not as bad as the original, like kind of when they first developed it. But I mean, if you remember the tube TVs.
Yes, the knob and tube ones from like 100 years ago.
Yeah, so the CRT, even like the ones in the 90s too, they all had the ability to output X-ray in some fashion. They gave off some.
Whoa, wait a minute. What?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was raised by a TV.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. That explains a lot.
Yeah. But it's not as, there are actually controls built into those TVs to actually prevent them from overvolting and sending out those that radiation. But theoretically, if someone tinkered around with it, they could get a nasty blast of radiation. So
now I know they weren't quite as intense of a radioactive blast as, say, like Hiroshima back then, but I'm assuming that like a Bond villain sort of like evil X-ray laser or something, right? Again, I was raised by television, so I have no understanding of how things work.
So those machines, they actually looked, if you kind of look, they're fairly similar, except everything looks like it's more crude, but the basic setup is the same.
Sure.
Difference is that we didn't really have a full grasp of what radiation poisoning was.
Oh, no.
So basically everybody in the room could be like right on top of what was going on, and that prolonged exposure, X-ray after X-ray after X-ray.
poor Pierre and Mary Curie had to find that out the hard way.
Yes, she did.
That's crazy. Explains the vomiting.
Yeah, going back to our nausea vomiting, the 1920s version of a homeopath or a 2020 version of a homeopath. They're probably the same thing, but I think the homeopath in the 1920s kind of was more mainstream, wasn't as out there as they are today, just because still didn't have much to treat things. We had a lot of our drugs came from plants still back then. People were still using that compound. I mean, I think we're starting to get towards the end of the era where people were giving cocaine for things, alcohol.
Yeah. What's a homeopath now like, doctor?
If you listen to the episode we did kind of liken his personal physician, Dr. Charles Sawyer, to be as though Joe Biden had Gwyneth Paltrow as his personal physician now.
I'd say if the modern equivalent, yes. Back in his day, I think he'd have the equivalent of Dr. Oz.
Okay.
Be the best thing. It was still recognized as actual medicine to be done at that point. It was just starting to become less and less popular within the mainstream medical community at the time. But he was still giving him laxatives, trying to make him poop everything out, still trying to give him things to help him vomit, to try and get rid of whatever was inside of him.
Yeah, I was reading a book about Warren G. Harding because, that's what I do.
Yeah.
And that's the complaint that he had was that all Dr. Charles Sawyer gave him was just laxatives over and over again. And
it'll very quickly dehydrate you. And if someone were to get dehydrated enough and they were to lose enough volume, you could get in a situation where your heart just doesn't get enough oxygen because your volume's so low, and that would kill someone. The original cause of death for Warren was listed as basically a stroke or cerebral hemorrhage. That being said, the more looking into it, more modern physicians have looked into it, sounds like more of a heart attack of something that goes very quickly. Does that rule out a stroke? No, but that constant volume depletion, if you're given losing a lot of volume, that heart attack can be a risk.
All right, I got to play devil's advocate. Based on everything you know about his death, do you think that assassination is still on the table?
Ooh. And the answer is
one little
yes.
detail about the case that I find interesting is that both his wife, who's considered to be, the architect of the assassination, and no one would blame her, and Dr. Charles Sawyer both died within about a year of Warren G. Harding.
Well, shoot, I was going to say Sawyer was the assassin in this case. Very possible that someone could have, knowing what medical treatment, they could have gave him some kind of stomach bug, fed him some bad food on purpose. Be very easy to do that, especially if you're out in the middle of nowhere. Be pretty easy to just sneak him some bad food very easily, knowing his personal physician and what he was going to do. Is it out of the realm of possibility? No, I don't think so. I think that would be a very easy thing, especially with the circumstances surrounding his burial being very quick. So yes, I think it's possible. Do I think it's likely? No, I subscribe to the theory that the simplest explanation is the most likely explanation. So
I mean, that's not the most fun explanation.
Yeah, I know it's not fun.
I mean, it is entirely within the realms of the possibility that a man who was a smoker, not particularly healthy, in his 50s in such a stressful position, not to mention he was, if he had lived, he would have certainly faced impeachment. I could see that leading up to a heart attack.
And he was treated by a shaman witch doctor.
And the witch doctor. Yeah.
I mean, definitely the stress definitely adds to that. And that's something that we've seen, especially in the rise of corporate America, the amount of heart attacks that we see that were in like this 70s, 80s, 90s, that rate of heart attack just kind of went up very rapidly. So definitely stress can and does play a role in heart attacks. So I think just everything kind of coming together all at once, it was just the perfect storm of terribleness.
So this is more of a question, goes back to his treatment and his doctor, his witch doctor, we'll say. Now, as a modern day physician yourself, do you run into a lot of people that say, look, I know you're a board certified physician. However, Gwyneth Paltrow says, like, do you run into a lot of that, like, sort of homeopathic stuff now? And is it because a lot of the things I hear is that sort of thing is on the rise and people are trying alternative things and it's not really working? But what are your thoughts on that, I guess?
So I have run into a few people who do want to try that kind of natural way of doing things. For the most part, generally they don't work because there's more you have to change into that. Like, for the most part, I'm okay if you want to lower your blood pressure, I'm okay if you try and exercise more, you try and eat better, do it without medication. I never thought of that
as homeopathic. I never thought of that before. That's a great way to frame that.
And it's, because the homeopathic is more than just kind of the weird herbs that it's kind of looking at the whole person as a whole. And sometimes I do get some of those crackpots that like, oh, I'm going to try this random thing. I'm like, you probably shouldn't do that. Your blood pressure is, I don't know, 200 over 120. I mean, you probably are about to stroke out right now. Let's get you to the emergency department. But generally speaking, I give them a few months and they say, hey, this isn't working. We need to let modern medicine step in. The place where I've seen it the most probably recently is surrounding COVID. And I'd like to thank Dr. Facebook. Yes, Dr. Facebook has got his MD from the school of YouTube and Reddit and inaccurate dank memes. But I feel like there's just a lot of information and we've progressed so much since the first half of the 20th century to where we know kind of how science works, how we process information, how we test things, and how we test for safety. And it's come a very long way. And those doctors really set the groundwork, and those scientists set the groundwork for how we develop things and how quickly we're able to roll out and test treatments and see if they work. And it's a very good system. And generally speaking, things are very safe. And if they're not safe, we find out very quickly. It's not something that we can keep under the rug, unlike what Facebook tells us. So
no one's hiding a dark secret for profit. I mean, I think
please. No.
Vaccines like constitute 3% of Eli Lilly's profit. Like that's their business.
Eli Lilly's business is insulin, let me tell you.
There you go.
Insulin and Cialis, that's what they make their money off of.
There you go. Pete, you got anything else for the good doctor?
No, I'm just, once again, thank you so much for joining us. I cannot wait to do another interview with you when we talk about how James Garfield died. Talk about some bad doctoring.
Yes, bad doctoring. I love bad doctoring. It's so much fun to look at.
I was going to say with this little sub show of ours, it's not going to take much medical knowledge for certain presidents, like I would say like Abe Lincoln, how did he die? He was shot in the head. A bullet went through his brain.
Lead poisoning.
It's kind of cut and dry.
Yeah.
Cut and dry. I've actually seen, there's some stories I could tell about that and kind of the process of could Lincoln have survived in a modern setting.
Oh, I can't wait.
I mean, do you want to get into that now?
So Lincoln was shot in the head. Now, depending on where he was shot and how he was shot, that is very important. Basically, there are different parts of your brain. So your brain stem controls all your functions. So you're able to breathe, regulate heart rate, all that good stuff. So that's at the base of your skull, right before your spinal cord. The front of your brain, that controls like kind of personality, things like that. You can live without your frontal lobe and pretty much half of your brain. By definition, to live is subjective there. Basically, it requires you to be hooked up to monitors, a feeding tube, but you can survive after being shot in the head. And it's often very devastating because the thing that kills you, one of the things that can kill someone after being shot in the head, if the bullet itself doesn't just kind of destroy the brain on the way in, is the swelling after the fact. So once it's injured, your brain, the natural reaction to basically any part of your body is to swell up and cause edema. And the problem in your head is there's nowhere for that pressure to go but one place, and that's going down through your spinal cord. So what happens is you herniate through your spinal cord, and that pushes your brainstem down, and that kills you because it cuts off your ability to breathe. And once that happens, there's no going back from that. That is a terminal thing that happens. So what happens to avoid that is you take off half of someone's skull to decrease the pressure. and then you wait until the swelling goes down to put the bone back in.
Oh, that's so cool.
So not only does
We
that
could have
happen
had,
with
a Civil War Part 2.
Yeah.
The sequel was ruined.
So not only does that happen with people getting shot, it also happens with people with hemorrhagic strokes. So when they have a brain bleed, that's the same thing that happens. That pressure builds up, and then they herniate, and then they die. That's how someone dies with the hemorrhagic stroke. It's not the actual losing blood; it's the pressure inside the head that herniates.
I know during wartime, we were basically taught as medics to keep someone alive until we found somebody like you, Dr. Matt. And a common injury we were taught to look out for was traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
Right? Because like you'll be in a car and then boom goes the road and then you're just flying, right? Because you'd think, oh, his head's in one piece, but you don't realize, oh, your brain can just jiggle around in there, right? And then get swollen up. But is that a treatment for, like, you're driving and there's a concussive force blast of energy that hits your head and shakes it real bad? Like, would that be an applicable treatment? It's cutting the head open and letting the pressure out.
It'd have to depend on the circumstance. That one's not as cut and dry. Did they ever tell you kind of to check the pupils, like kind of shine the light?
Yeah.
Do you know why they told you to check the pupils?
Not really.
It's for that herniation.
Got it.
Because once your pupils go and they're blown and they're fixed and that's bad.
That's a symptom of herniation of the spinal cord. Oh, that's so cool.
You mentioned that like it's still kind of debated whether or not Abraham Lincoln could have survived. You talked about like removing part of the skull to alleviate the brain. Like, would that kind of surgery be done in the 1860s, or is that more modern?
It's more modern, but
like, I'll be honest, I haven't done the research about like what kind of treatment he received. I mean, I just kind of thought you got shot in the head. I know he died. He survived for a few hours.
He survived for a few hours. So what they could have like done potentially is they could have drilled holes into his skull, and I think that was done in the 1800s, not for the right reasons, but had they drilled holes into his skull, relieved some of that pressure, he could have survived a little longer. However, I think the infection from drilling into his skull probably would have killed him too.
Probably didn't have very sterile equipment back then.
Yeah, no. What is sterile equipment?
It goes back to James Garfield, who, I think modern medicine said he probably would have survived had he not been treated by his doctor.
Remind us how President Garfield died again.
So James Garfield, he was shot twice, once in the arm and once in the abdomen. He survived for 4 months, and like in the train station after being shot, doctors were brought to the scene and they already started poking and prodding. They had no sterilization. They did not sterilize their hands. They didn't sterilize their equipment. And as a result, the wounds became infected. And then for months on end, they just were really persistent about finding that bullet. They thought if they found the bullet, they could save his life. So just continuously using unsterilized equipment on him and rejecting any doctor who came in with any other opinions.
I'm surprised he lasted 4 months. That's pretty impressive.
Oh, I mean, he was a great man. I guess he just had a good immune system.
Yeah, I mean, those wounds that once wounds get infected, it's the treatment modern days. You have to remove the dead tissue for any kind of hope of recovery. Just kind of looking at, I just pulled up the Wikipedia page, but it looks like they tried.
That's how we do our research too.
Right. It looks like they tried to insert a drainage tube to see if there's an abscess, which is actually what we would modern do, except we do that in surgery. We'd find the abscess, drain it, and then we put a tube from the inside of your stomach out to the outside in a little bulb. And what that does is that takes any kind of blood or any kind of infections that accumulates, and it gives it a path out from the inside of someone's abdominal cavity into this tiny little bulb. And it's the negative pressure that kind of drags all that out. So looks like they tried to do that, but they just didn't. I don't think they had the technology to save him. And if those wounds got infected, it would have been very difficult for him to survive. But it looks like they tried to use x-rays to figure out where the bullet was, which wasn't a terrible idea.
Well, it was Alexander Graham Bell who invented it. Yeah, from what I read, one of the reasons why he was unable to find it is that they didn't take into consideration that the mattress he had, the bed springs were metal. Yeah. They could find metal everywhere because the guy was on a bed.
So they did an x-ray on a dude who was on a bed with metal springs in it?
Yes.
So it probably wasn't a very effective image.
Probably not, no. Depending on how close the x-rays were and what else was surrounding him, it probably would have looked like a complete, like just blown out white x-ray. It would have been very difficult to find that bullet. Could they have, like, if they had modern technology, I think they might have been able to do that even on that spring bed if they just kind of moved him a little bit and used like kind of to change the exposure on a computer. It can make it a little easier to pick things out. Because we can see a lot of things on x-ray. That's just a real sad story. I mean,
sounds like they tried. They had like real actual doctors and not like voodoo shaman or anything.
Yeah, and I mean, they just tried. They just didn't have that sterile technique. It looks like some of the other kind of theories behind Garfield's death is that he had that bullet went into his spleen and it caused a pseudo aneurysm, and then that ruptured, and then he would have bled out from that. Not a great way to go, but I mean, the infection, that infection definitely contributed to his cause of death there.
All right. You got anything else for him, Pete?
I could bother you all day about every dead president, but I've got a feeling that your time is precious and I don't want to take it.
Well, Dr. Matt, thank you so much for joining us again. For the Dead President Society, I am Derwin.
I am Pete.
And I'm Dr. Matt.
And that's how the tombstone crumbles. Thanks, guys.